The first sound was not a scream, it was the absence of one. A room meant for 34 sleeping children lay intact beneath a ceiling rimed with frost, the air sour with coal smoke and boiled potatoes gone cold. Beds were made tight, blankets folded with practiced hands. Shoes stood in pairs, toes aligned, leather stiff from winter. On a table in the corridor, bowls of soup filmed over, still faintly warm, a skin forming as if time itself had hesitated. Somewhere deeper in the building, a record spun without interruption, its needle trapped in a lullaby's final groove, repeating a promise it could no longer keep. No blood marked the floor. No window was broken. No door was forced. The night had passed through like breath through lungs, leaving nothing displaced except the people. Outside, the snow bore no tracks, not of boots, not of bare feet. The pines stood unmoved, their branches heavy, their needles dark and watchful. The iron gate hung half open, its hinge creaking once in the wind and then falling still. Smoke lingered above the chimney longer than it should have, curling back on itself, refusing to disperse, as if the building exhaled and then forgot how to breathe in. When the first man crossed the threshold at dawn, he did not call out, he did not turn back. He walked room to room with his hat still on, lips moving without sound, eyes widening at things that left no mark. He would be found hours later sitting upright in his own cabin, staring at a wall, mouth working around words that never arrived. He did not die. He simply stopped speaking, as though speech had become unnecessary. There are places where silence is not empty. It presses, it listens, it remembers the shape of bodies long after they are gone. This was one of those places, an orphanage raised of red brick and routine, built to collect the unwanted, the unnamed, the already erased. A building meant to hold children until they could be given away to the future. Instead, it held its breath and kept them. If you are hearing this now, pause with me for a moment. Which city are you listening from? And what time is it right now? Let the answer settle where you are, because time matters in stories like this. It always has. The year was 1936. Winter had locked the land into a hard white silence near the Ural Mountains, far from roads that asked questions. Maps from the period show a dot where the village should be, a smudge of ink surrounded by forest, the kind of place bureaucrats forgot as easily as they forgot names. The orphanage had a number instead of a name, a designation that slid easily into ledgers and disappeared just as easily from them. Children arrived on trains with no parents to claim them, some too young to speak, others already old in the eyes. Staff were transferred in, signed forms, learned the rules. Wake at 6, porridge, lessons, quiet, always quiet. By the morning of February 23rd, the rules remained, the people did not. The record kept spinning, the snow kept falling, and the building waited, as if expecting someone to notice what had been taken from it. The village nearest the orphanage did not appear on most maps, and when it did, the name shifted depending on the year and the hand that wrote it. Borders moved, administrations changed, ink was scraped away and replaced. What remained constant was the forest. Birch and pine pressed inward from all sides, their roots threading the soil like veins, their canopies knitting the sky into something dimmer. In winter, sound died quickly there. Voices fell flat. Footsteps vanished after a few paces. It was a place where news arrived late and left early, and where questions learned to lower their heads. The orphanage had been built during the push to organize the unorganizable. Children without families were liabilities, numbers that needed somewhere to sleep. The building was functional, almost austere, narrow corridors, low ceilings, windows set high, as if to discourage looking out. Inside, everything smelled of soap, starch, and coal dust. Each dormitory was identical to the next, beds arranged in rows, blankets folded to the same width, a discipline imposed not just on bodies, but on space itself. Above every doorway hung a small cross, not for comfort, but tradition, left over from a time before new rules replaced old ones. Records from the district office listed 34 children housed there in early 1936, infants, toddlers, adolescents already hardened by hunger. 11 adults were assigned to them, teachers, nurses, a cook, orderlies, and one head caretaker. Their names appear once, then never again. In the margins of those records are small inconsistencies, dates that do not align, birthplaces that repeat too often, transfers approved without signatures. At the time, no one lingered on such details. In Stalin's Russia paper was not meant to explain, it was meant to conclude. The caretaker was a woman named Valentina. She had arrived the previous year with a limp she never explained and a face that seemed carved from fatigue. She enforced silence with precision. No running, no shouting. Music only before sleep, never after. At exactly 9 each night she played the same record, a cradle song older than the state, warning of wolves beyond the window. The children learned the tune before they learned to read. They were told it kept them safe. Locals kept their distance. Not out of fear at first, but out of habit. The air around the building always felt colder, even in spring, as if winter lingered there longer than it should. Dogs refused to walk past the iron gate. Birds never settled on the roof. When villagers spoke of the place, they lowered their voices without realizing it, the way people do in churches or grave sites. On the night of February 22nd, snow fell steadily, erasing the world in layers. Inside, supper was served, a child coughed, medicine was given. Keys jingled during final rounds. At 9, the record began to play. And then, between one breath and the next, something shifted. Not loudly, not violently, just enough. By morning, the village had one more silence than it knew how to carry. Among the 34, there was one the staff spoke about, only when they thought no one else was listening. Not because he was violent or loud, but because he unsettled the order of things. His name appears inconsistently in the intake logs, sometimes written one way, sometimes another, as if even the ink hesitated. He had arrived in winter, wrapped in a government-issued blanket, eyes already open, already watching. No parent accompanied him. No explanation followed, just a signature and a date that would later prove to be wrong. He did not cry like the infants. He did not cling like the toddlers. He observed. From his cot, he followed the movement of adults with a patience that felt rehearsed. When he learned to walk, he did not stumble. When he learned to speak, he skipped words meant for children and asked questions that made the nurses exchange glances. Where did people go when they were done being people? Why did names change? Why did the record always end the same way? By the time he was 5, he could recite the building's routines better than the staff. He knew when the boiler would hiss before it did. He knew which floorboard would creak in the corridor outside the infirmary. At night, while the others slept, he sat upright in bed, listening. Valentina caught him once during her rounds, eyes open in the dark, mouth moving in time with the lullaby, though the record had not yet started. She struck him for speaking after curfew. He did not cry. He only asked her why the song remembered them. Drawings began to appear in the margins of his schoolwork. Not houses, not trees, rooms, always rooms. Long hallways that folded back on themselves. Doors inside doors. A boiler drawn again and again, larger each time, beneath which something waited. Once, he drew faces all identical, lined in rows, their mouths open as if counting. The teacher burned the paper in the stove and told no one. Animals avoided him. The cat that slept near the kitchen hissed when he passed. Birds startled from the windowsill when he looked up at them. Other children grew quiet around him, not out of fear, but confusion. He spoke to them as if he had known them longer than he should have. He called them by names they did not recognize. Sometimes he answered questions they had not yet asked. Valentina recorded him more carefully than the others. Her private notes, recovered decades later, describe a child who behaved as if he were older than his body allowed. She wrote of dreams that felt shared, of waking with words in her mouth that were not her own. She wrote that he once described her husband's face in detail, a man long dead whose photograph had never been kept. The town began to whisper. Not loudly, just enough. Children sometimes carried things adults could not. Everyone knew that, but this felt different. As February drew closer, the boy grew restless. He stood too close to the walls, pressed his ear to the brick, listening for something beneath the building. When asked what he answered simply that the rooms were full, and that they were waiting. As the days shortened toward late February, the orphanage began to behave as if it were remembering something it had tried to forget. The boiler's hiss grew irregular, breathing in shallow bursts that startled the night staff awake. Lights flickered without pattern. Doors that had been latched were found open by morning, not wide, just enough to suggest a hand had tested them. The boy noticed first. He stopped sleeping altogether, and instead walked the corridors after lights out, bare feet silent on the boards, palms brushing the walls as if reading them. The other children changed around him. One began speaking numbers in her sleep, counting past what she had been taught. Another started drawing circles on the frost of the windows, over and over, until her fingers bled, and she did not seem to notice. A pair of twins, housed in separate rooms, began finishing each other's sentences without ever being together. When questioned, they said they practiced at night. Symbols appeared in places no one could explain, scratched into the underside of tables, etched faintly into the paint behind the boiler. Curved lines, repeating shapes, not letters from any alphabet the teachers recognized. Valentina ordered them scrubbed away, but by morning they returned, deeper, as if the walls themselves had taken offense at being cleaned. She punished the children collectively. Silence enforced more harshly than before, but the quiet only seemed to thicken, pressing against ears, settling into lungs. The boy began leading the others in small rituals that mimicked play from a distance but felt wrong up close. They arranged their shoes in perfect rows before bed, even those who could not yet tie laces. They tapped the walls 3 times before entering a room. They stood beneath the boiler each evening just 4 or 9, heads tilted back, listening to the pipes. When Valentina demanded to know what they were doing, the boy answered for them. Preparing. On the night animals started dying near the fence, the town took notice. Chickens were found stiff and intact, eyes clouded, no marks on their bodies. A dog refused to return home and was discovered days later frozen upright against a tree as if it had been listening too long. The villagers spoke of bad air, of old things stirred up by cold. No one mentioned the orphanage aloud, but everyone thought of it. Inside, the children's drawings grew more explicit, family trees that looped back into themselves, names written and rewritten until the paper tore, faces labeled with multiple roles, mother, sister, caretaker, all in the same careful hand. One page showed a woman with a limp standing at the center of a circle of children, her shadow stretching longer than it should, touching each of them. Valentina's notes from this period are brief, fragmented. She wrote that the children were remembering lives they had not lived, that they spoke of being born more than once, that the boy asked her why the state had given him back to her when she had already raised him before. The night before February 23rd, the lullaby began playing on its own. The truth did not arrive all at once. It surfaced the way rot does, slowly, through familiar grain. Valentina had always known there were inconsistencies in the children's files, but in the days before the disappearance, those inconsistencies began to align. Birth dates repeated with a precision that could no longer be dismissed as clerical error. Names resurfaced across different years, attached to different bodies, sometimes marked deceased, sometimes reassigned. The boy's file was the worst of them. His mother's name had been struck through and rewritten. His father's line was BL. Ank. Then, beneath a later entry, a note appeared in a hand that matched Valentina's own. Reassignment approved. Subject returned. She began waking with the taste of iron in her mouth and images she could not place. A smaller building, a different winter. A child who looked like the boy but called her by another name. In one memory she was younger, uninjured, holding an infant with his eyes already open. In another she was older, limping, watching that same face stare back at her from across a table. The memories overlapped, folded inward, until cause and effect lost meaning. The boy confronted her without anger. He sat across from her in the infirmary, feet not touching the floor, hands folded the way adults did when they were finished pretending. He told her she had not just raised him once. He told her she had given birth to him more than once, that the state had taken him away when he was inconvenient and returned him when he was needed. That names had been changed, dates shifted, but blood remembered. He called her mother, he called her sister, he called her caretaker, Each word landed with equal weight. Other children were the same, not siblings in the way towns understood, but repetitions, lines that bent back on themselves. Daughters who were also nieces, sons who were also fathers, their origins tangled in a deliberate confusion meant to erase responsibility. The orphanage was not correcting a problem, it was maintaining one. Generations collapsed into a single building, a closed system where ancestry could be controlled, observed, reused. Valentina realized then why the lullaby mattered, why it played the same each night. It was not to soothe, it was to synchronize, to keep memory aligned across bodies that shared too much of one another. The children were not learning, they were recalling. When the town would later speak of incest in hushed tones, E would get it wrong. This was not secrecy born of shame. It was structure, a family tree engineered to rot inward, producing children who belonged nowhere outside the walls that raised them. The boy was proof of concept. He carried her face in his eyes and her husband's in his hands. He was the end and the beginning folded into one small body. On the final night, as the children gathered beneath the boiler, Valentina understood what had been prepared. Not an escape, a correction, a return to something the building itself remembered how to do. She did not stop them. When the morning came, the town reacted the way small places always do when faced with something too large to name. First with denial, then with ritual, then with fire. The men who approached the orphanage that day did not speak as they walked. They carried icons wrapped in cloth, buckets of kerosene, lengths of rope. The church bell rang once, not to call prayer, but to mark a boundary. No one crossed the threshold after that first inspection. The building was declared wrong without being entered. Windows were boarded from the outside. The gate was chained. Someone painted a crude symbol over the door, half remembered from sermons and older stories, a shape meant to keep things in rather than out. Animals were slaughtered that week, whether they showed signs of sickness or not. Pigs, chickens, dogs that had lived too long too close to the fence, blood soaked into frozen ground already heavy with secrets. The elders led prayers that mixed scripture with folklore, asking forgiveness for questions that had been asked too late. Children were warned not to repeat the orphanage's name, as if words themselves could reopen doors. At night, smoke rose from barrels where papers were burned. Birth certificates, transfer orders, school records, anything that suggested continuity, anything that proved someone had come from someone else. The flames reflected in faces drawn tight with fear and relief. Erasure felt like action. It felt like control. The church sent a priest who did not stay long. He walked the perimeter once, refused to enter, and left behind a bottle of holy water poured directly into the soil at the foundation. He told no one what he felt, only that the ground was warm beneath his boots despite the frost. That warmth would be reported again and again by those who passed too close. Official men arrived days later, long coats, no insignia displayed. They took photographs, asked quiet questions, wrote nothing down where it could be seen. The building was padlocked under their direction, not condemned, not cleared, simply sealed, as if it were still occupied. When villagers asked what would happen to the children, they were told not to ask such things. The fire came later, small and controlled, not to destroy the structure, but to cleanse it. Curtains were burned, mattresses dragged into the courtyard and set alight. The smoke hung low and bitter. When the flames died, the brick still stood, blackened but intact, holding its shape with stubborn patience. It did not collapse, it did not crack, it absorbed the heat as if it had been waiting for it. In the weeks that followed, people avoided the road. Snow fell heavier there. Trees leaned inward. Silence gathered in the empty rooms and did not leave. Those who spoke of the children did so only in the past tense, and even then only indirectly. They said things like, "It ended," or "It was handled." But nothing that rots inward ever truly ends. It only waits to be found again by someone who does not know why they are looking. In the late 1980s, when archives loosened just enough to breathe, a man in Moscow began noticing gaps where records should have been. He was not looking for an orphanage. He was cataloging red undances in regional health files, tracing how names vanished and reappeared across decades. Patterns interested him more than stories. Repetition was a language he trusted. And there, Threaded through requisition forms and transfer approvals, he found it. A designation without context, a facility number that surfaced, disappeared, and resurfaced again, always in winter, always tied to children whose dates did not behave. He traveled east with permission stamped by someone who no longer remembered granting it. The village had thinned since 1936. Houses leaned. Roads ended abruptly. When he asked about the orphanage, people answered with weather, with crops, with nothing at all. Only one woman, old enough to have been a child herself when it happened, told him where the building had stood. She did not give a name. She pointed into the trees and said, quietly, it was the place where families forgot how to count. The foundation remained, stones sunk into soil that resisted growth. The researchers set up equipment meant to measure heat, density, absence. His instruments malfunctioned often, returning readings that contradicted one another. Warmth beneath frozen ground, voids shaped too precisely to be natural, rows of empty space aligned as if something had been carefully removed without disturbing the earth around it. In a regional office, he found photographs misfiled among agricultural surveys. Children seated at desks, hands folded, staring into the lens with expressions too old for their faces. No names were written on the backs, only dates, all the same, 2 days before the disappearance. In one image, a chair stood empty, the space around it blurred, as if the camera had failed to agree on what should be there. He followed the paper trail further and uncovered something worse. Several of the children listed had death certificates dated years before the orphanage. Officially opened. Causes varied. Disease, accident, wartime loss. And yet there they were, photographed, documented, alive again, reused. The researcher submitted his findings. They were classified within a week. His equipment was confiscated. He was reassigned to work that did not require travel. Before leaving, he mailed copies of the photographs to a colleague, then burned his notes in a hotel sink. The smell of singed paper followed him for days. He would later tell his wife one thing before he stopped speaking of it altogether. He said the orphanage was not built to raise children. It was built to hold a pattern in place, a way of keeping bloodlines close enough to study, to repeat, to correct. He said the children were not taken that night. They were retrieved. Every February after that, reports surfaced quietly, sounds near the old foundation, footsteps without prints, a lullaby heard by those who did not know its name. The researcher stopped marking those dates on his calendar. He did not need reminders anymore. The silence knew when to return. The last confirmed mention of the orphanage does not come from an archive or a witness, but from a form that was never meant to be read as a story. It is a neonatal intake record dated February 23rd, decades after the building was sealed. The location field is blank. The child's weight is average. The APGAR score is normal. The handwriting is steady, bureaucratic, unremarkable. Only one detail stands out. Under family history, a single line has been written, then carefully underlined. Maternal lineage, continuous. No names follow. No origin is listed. Just continuity asserted as fact. In the years that follow, similar records appear in different regions, always briefly, always corrected, always disappearing into new systems. Children adopted quickly, children transferred, children whose eyes track movement too. Early, who do not cry when separated, who listen to walls as if waiting for instruction. Teachers describe them as quiet, observant, old-souled if they are kind, difficult if they are not. Some draw rooms they have never seen. Some hum songs no one taught them. Some ask, with unsettling calm, why their mother looks different this time. Nothing connects them on paper. That is the point. The structure learned from its failure. It no longer needs walls, boilers, or synchronized lullabies. The pattern survived without the building. Blood does not require architecture. It carries its own memory. The village faded. The foundation sank deeper into soil that refused to grow clean. When roads were rerouted, the place was marked as unstable terrain and left alone. Even now, hikers report a sense of compression there, as if space folds slightly inward, as if rooms still exist beneath their feet, carefully aligned, waiting to be filled. Valentina's final notebook was discovered in a private estate sale, mislabeled among household accounts. The last page contains only one sentence, written repeatedly until the ink tore through the paper. "We did not make monsters. We made returns. The orphanage did not end in fire or silence. It ended in distribution, in diffusion, in a system that learned how to persist by becoming small enough to hide inside ordinary families. And somewhere tonight, a child is lying awake in a perfectly normal home, listening to the house settle, counting the pauses between sounds, remembering a place they have never been, and waiting for the next February.